The bracelet wasn't lost. It was planted. Vivienne Cross knew exactly where it was when she pointed her manicured finger at Imani Bellrose and said, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, someone should check her bag. 300 people turned at once. Security moved in. And Imani, a 29-year-old woman who had done nothing but carry champagne glasses for 6 hours straight, stood in the center of that gilded room, while strangers whispered things about her that she will never fully forget. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked directly at every single person who wouldn't meet her eyes. And somewhere across that ballroom, Roman Calder set down his glass and stood up. If you've ever been in a room where someone tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, this for you. Stay until the very end. And before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night Imani Bellrose's life changed forever started the way most of her nights did, badly, quietly, and without any warning. She had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. Her left shoe had developed a small tear along the inner seam, somewhere around hour 3. And every time she shifted her weight, which was constantly, because that was the job, shift and carry and smile and vanish, she could feel the leather biting into the soft skin above her heel. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to. The catering staff operated like a single organism at these events: move fast, stay invisible, never give the guests a reason to look directly at you. That last part was the unspoken rule, the one nobody wrote down but everyone understood. The Calder estate sat at the northern edge of Chicago's Gold Coast, like it had grown there organically, as if wealth had simply decided to take physical form and rest against the lakefront. From the outside, it looked old. The kind of old that cost money to maintain. Limestone columns, wrought iron gates, gardens that had probably been redesigned 4 times in the last decade by people who charged more per hour than Imani made in a week. Inside was worse, or better, depending on who you were. The engagement celebration was for someone named Callum Calder Roman's younger brother and his fiancée, a woman from a Boston family, whose last name Imani had already forgotten because nobody had introduced them, and she hadn't asked. The guest list included city aldermen, federal contractors, socialites, whose photographs appeared in magazines that Imani occasionally saw in waiting rooms. There were women in this room wearing jewelry worth more than the building Imani rented her apartment in. She was carrying their empty glasses. "You missed one," said a voice beside her. Imani turned. Another server, Marcus, mid-20s, perpetually nervous, nodded toward a half-empty champagne flute sitting on the edge of a marble side table near the fireplace. She hadn't missed it. She'd been about to get it. But she picked it up without correcting him, added it to her tray, and kept moving. That was the job. She was making her way back toward the kitchen corridor when the first disruption happened. It started as a high, sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the center of the room, followed immediately by the particular silence that spreads through a crowd when someone important has stopped talking. Imani had worked enough of these events to recognize the shift. She slowed without stopping. "My grandmother's bracelet." The voice was feminine, controlled in the way of someone who had been trained from childhood to perform distress attractively. "It's gone. I had it on my wrist 20 minutes ago, and now it's simply gone." Vivienne Cross was standing in the middle of the room in a pale gold dress that had probably taken someone 8 weeks to make. She was tall, blonde, exactly the kind of woman who walked into spaces like this and rearranged them around herself without effort. Her fiancé, or someone who functioned like one, hovered beside her, looking appropriately concerned. She was scanning the room. Imani recognized the scan. She'd seen it before. At smaller events, a guest loses something. Their eyes travel instinctively toward whoever seems the most out of place. It wasn't malicious, necessarily. It was a reflex. A small, ugly reflex that most people never examined in themselves. Vivienne's eyes moved across the room and then stopped. They stopped on Imani, not on the 2 other servers closest to where the bracelet was allegedly lost. Not on the caterer's manager who had been circulating all evening. On Imani specifically. The tallest server. The fullest figure. The darkest skin in the room. "Someone should check the staff," Vivienne said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still pleasant. Still controlled. It wouldn't be the first time something went missing at one of these events. The room didn't erupt. It contracted. That was somehow worse, this collective held breath, this moment where everyone understood exactly what was being implied, and nobody said anything to stop it. Two security guards were already moving. Imani stood completely still. She had done this calculation before in her life, not at an event this large, not with this many people watching, but the math was the same. If she moved, she looked guilty. If she spoke, she was being difficult. The only option was to remain exactly where she was and let it play out, which meant accepting that she was going to be searched in front of 300 strangers. The tray was still in her hands. She didn't put it down. One of the guards, young, uncomfortable, clearly unhappy about what he'd been asked to do, stepped closer. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to set that down." I heard Imani set the tray on the nearest surface with a precision that had nothing to do with gentleness. From somewhere behind her she heard it, a man's voice, low enough to be deniable. "Better get a bigger bag to check." And then the sound of other men laughing. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, below the ribs. Not because it was new, she had heard variations of that particular cruelty her whole life, but because they hadn't even lowered their voices. They hadn't bothered. That was the part she would remember later. Not the accusation, not the security guard's hands hovering near her jacket. The laughter, the ease of it. She raised her eyes. Across the room, standing near a window that overlooked the dark lakefront, was a man she had not noticed before. She wasn't sure how. He was tall, not dramatically, but enough. Dark suit, no tie. A stillness about him that was different from the composed stillness of the guests around him. They were still because they were comfortable. He was still the way a room is still, right before something inside it breaks. He was watching her, not in the way the others were watching her, with discomfort or amusement or that performative outrage that looks like sympathy, but is really just relief at not being the one standing in the center. He was watching her the way you watch something that doesn't make sense yet, working it out. Imani looked away. The guard was asking for her jacket pocket. She unzipped it, empty. He checked her apron, empty. He asked quietly, which she gave him credit for, whether she had a bag nearby. She told him it was in the staff locker downstairs. He nodded and said he'd need to have someone retrieve it. Fine, her voice was flat. Not hostile, just flat. There was a wall she had built over years out of necessity, and she was standing behind it. "Actually," said a new voice, "search everyone." The room changed again. It was the man from the window. He hadn't moved dramatically. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply spoken, and somehow those two words had traveled from one end of the ballroom to the other, with the kind of authority that didn't need volume behind it. Roman Calder. Imani didn't know his name yet. She would later understand that she had been serving champagne in the home of the most powerful criminal in the city of Chicago, and she had genuinely not recognized him, which would embarrass her retrospectively. And also, she would admit to no one, make her feel a small involuntary pulse of amusement. In the moment, she only knew that whoever this man was, the entire room had reorganized itself in response to 4 syllables. Every handbag. Everyone standing near where Miss Cross was during the last hour. His eyes swept the room in a way that was almost methodical, including mine. Vivienne's composure cracked just slightly, just for a second, just enough. "Roman, that's completely unnecessary. I'm sure the girl simply, Miss Cross." He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Quiet. Absolute. Let them search. The security chief, older, expensive-looking, with the particular bearing of a former law enforcement officer who had discovered that private security paid better, hesitated visibly. Roman looked at him once. The man pulled out a radio. The next 7 minutes were the longest of Imani's recent memory. Handbags opened. Jacket pockets turned out. 2 aldermen looked deeply put upon. A woman near the bar made a comment about the whole thing being barbaric. Nobody left. The bracelet was found in Vivienne Cross's clutch. The security officer who found it held it up, and for a moment nobody breathed, and then the room erupted in exactly the kind of noise that gilded rooms make when something they weren't supposed to see has just been fully visible. Vivienne said something about how confused she was, how it must have slipped from her wrist and fallen in, how she hadn't realized. The words were still technically coherent. The performance was not. Her face had gone a color that had nothing to do with champagne. Imani watched it happen from 3 feet away. She felt she would try to articulate this later, alone in her apartment. Staring at the ceiling, she felt the wave of vindication and the specific exhaustion that followed it. Because being proven right didn't undo the experience of being accused. The laughter was still there. The ease of the assumption was still there. Those 7 minutes had still happened. Roman fired the security chief on the spot. Not dramatically, not with a speech. He simply said to the room in general, James is no longer employed here as of tonight. His conduct toward a member of the catering staff was unacceptable. Then, to the young guard who'd done the search, you'll be compensated for tonight in full. Nobody argued with him. Imani watched it unfold with the particular detachment of someone who is processing multiple things at once and has temporarily suspended all of them. She didn't speak to Roman Calder that night, not in the ballroom. He didn't approach her, and she didn't seek him out, and the crowd between them collapsed back into its normal arrangement as if nothing had happened, because for most of them, nothing truly had. An interesting moment at a party. Something to mention at brunch. By 9:30, the catering manager was pulling Imani aside. He was a small man named Graham who had been running catering operations for 16 years and who had developed, through those 16 years, a very specific cowardice that wore the face of practicality. I'm going to have to let you go tonight, he said. He was looking at her left ear. The client's family has expressed concerns about given the situations. I didn't steal anything. I know that. He still wasn't looking at her. But the optics of continuing to have you on site, given that a guest directly. She lied. It was in her bag. Imani. He finally met her eyes, and she saw in his face not malice, but something almost worse. The genuine belief that he was being reasonable. I have a contract with this family. I'm sorry. She collected her things from the staff locker without speaking to anyone. Marcus was in the corridor, and he said something quiet that might have been an apology and might have been nothing. And she didn't respond either way. Outside, the rain had arrived properly, not a drizzle. The kind of November rain that Chicago produces with a kind of grim commitment, horizontal in places, cold in ways that go straight through whatever you're wearing, because whatever you're wearing was not designed for this. Imani stood on the sidewalk outside the estate gate and went through her options. The bus ran infrequently at this hour, and the stop was a 12-minute walk. She had $14. And some change in her jacket pocket, which ruled out a cab. Her phone had 11% battery. Her shift had been supposed to run until midnight, and she had been dismissed at 9:40, which meant she had lost roughly 2 hours of pay. She started walking. She was half a block from the gate when she heard footsteps behind her that were not trying to be quiet, which meant that they were not threatening. Threatened footsteps tried to be quiet, in her experience, and she turned. Roman Calder was standing 10 feet away holding a jacket. Not his own, was on his back. This was a longer coat, charcoal-colored, the kind that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She stared at him for a moment. It's for you, he said. It was not a question. It was also not a command. It occupied some third grammatical category she didn't have a word for. I'm fine. It's 42 degrees and you're walking. I've walked in the cold before. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. Around them, the rain continued its business regardless. Please take the jacket, he said finally. She took it. Not because he asked. Because it was 42 degrees, and she had a 12-minute walk, and she was practical enough to make that distinction clearly in her own mind. She had barely put it on when he reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope. Thick, sealed. Compensation, he said. For what happened tonight. What Graham did was not acceptable. Imani looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She held it out. He didn't take it. I'm not a charity case, she said. I know. Then why are you handing me money on a sidewalk? Because a woman was publicly accused of theft in my home, and the people responsible for that home's operations then punished her for it. He said it without heat, without performance. Just the facts of it, laid out plainly. The compensation is fair, not charitable. Fair to who? He paused. It was a small pause, barely a second, but she caught it. To you. She put the envelope in his jacket pocket, the one she was wearing, and zipped it closed. I'll think about it. He almost smiled. She was not entirely sure. It was the very beginning of an expression that he seemed to catch before it became one. All right, he said. She turned and kept walking. She had made it roughly 40 feet when she heard him again. Your name. She stopped without turning. What about it? I'd like to know it. She stood in the rain for a moment, considering the strangeness of the entire night, the accusation, the bracelet, the firing, and now this. A man she did not know standing on a wet sidewalk in the cold, asking for her name like it was something he had lost and needed returned. Imani, she said. She walked. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps. He wasn't following. He was just standing there, presumably, in the rain, watching her go. When she reached the bus stop, 11 minutes, not 12, because she had walked faster than usual, she reached into the jacket pocket and found the envelope still there. She had put it in his jacket, the one she was wearing, which was his. She stood under the bus shelter and looked at the envelope for a long time. She didn't open it. She didn't throw it away. She put it back in the pocket and told herself she would deal with it tomorrow. Tomorrow turned out to be complicated. She called Graham at 9 in the morning to confirm her schedule for the week. He told her, in the same practical court voice, that the agency was releasing her from their roster. The Calder family had substantial contracts with multiple agencies, he explained, and while he personally had no issue with her work, the optics of retaining someone who had been involved in an incident. She stopped listening after incident. She spent the rest of the morning making calls. 2 other catering agencies had heard something she wasn't sure how, wasn't sure what exactly had circulated, and neither was enthusiastic. A restaurant she'd worked at briefly 2 years ago had no openings. A hotel downtown wanted someone with more recent front-of-house experience. By afternoon, she was sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a spreadsheet in front of her that she had built out of a combination of stubbornness and genuine need. Rent was 17 days out. Her nursing school tuition installment was due in 22 days. Says savings, after the past 3 months of irregular work, were not going to cover both. She had known this before last night. Last night had simply removed the one job that was keeping the math barely functional. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried at a kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon. She saved that for later, privately, in the shower, where the sound didn't carry. She opened another tab and started looking at diner jobs. There was one on the south side, about 4 miles from her apartment, that was hiring for nights. No experience required beyond serving. The pay was not good. The hours were not great. It was a 20-minute bus ride away. She applied. She got an interview for the following day. She got the job 2 hours after the interview. 3 weeks after the worst night of her professional life, Imani Bellrose was pouring coffee at a diner on the south side of Chicago, wearing a slightly too large uniform shirt and the particular focused calm of a person who has decided again to survive. That was where Roman Calder found her. She looked up from a table she was wiping down, and he was sitting in the corner booth like he hadn't walked through the door at all, like he had simply materialized there, and for one truly bizarre moment, she thought she was imagining it. She wasn't. He was wearing a simpler version of the same kind of clothes, dark, well-cut, no tie, and he looked deeply out of place in the diner's vinyl and fluorescent environment, in a way that he seemed either unaware of or unbothered by. She walked over. She did not say, "What are you doing here?" She did not say, "Did you find me?" She said, "What can I get you?" Because she was working, and this was still a table, and those were still the rules. "Coffee," he said. "And when you have a moment, I need to ask you something." She poured his coffee. She finished the other 2 tables that needed attention. She took an order from a couple by the window. She came back and stood across from him with the coffee pot in her hand and said, "What?" Roman Calder, the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld and could silence a room of 300 powerful people with 4 words, looked, for the briefest moment, like someone about to do something he had genuinely never done before. "I need a wife," he said. The coffee pot was still in her hand. She did not move it. "No," she said. "Haven't heard the offer." "That's because you used the word need, which tells me this isn't a proposal. It's a transaction. I'm not interested in being someone's transaction." He looked at her. She looked at him. The diner continued its ambient existence, around them coffee machine gurgling, couple by the window arguing quietly about something. Cook in the back calling out an order number. "One is here," he said. "Separate lives, mostly. Public appearances when the situation requires them. At the end of the year, you'll have enough to cover your remaining tuition, eliminate your current debt, and start whatever comes next." She set the coffee pot down on the table because her arm was getting tired, and she refused to let it show. You know about my tuition, yes. And my debt, yes. How? It wasn't a question. The flatness of her voice communicated that she already knew the answer and was deciding what to do with it. I had someone look into you, he said, before I came here. You investigated me. Yes. She absorbed this. She felt something move through her that was somewhere between rage and a cold, clarifying anger, the difference being that rage made you loud, and the clarifying kind was precise. And you thought, she said, that knowing how desperate I was would make me more likely to say yes. I thought it was relevant information. It's an invasion. Probably. He didn't apologize. She found she disliked that slightly less than if he had. The offer is real, and the terms are non-negotiable. Everything is negotiable. The compensation isn't. It stays what I said. I don't care about the compensation. She picked the coffee pot back up. I care that you walked in here, having looked through my life, like it was a file you could open and close, and you presented it to me like you were doing me a favor. I'm not doing you a favor, he said. I'm making a business proposal to someone whose circumstances make her a viable candidate for it. The words were honest. She would give him that. They were also probably the second or third least romantic thing a human being had ever said to her, which wasn't entirely irrelevant given that they were discussing marriage. You should go, she said. He went, but he left a card on the table. No name on it, just a phone number. And he left $32 for coffee that cost $2.50, which she put directly into the tip jar and told herself meant nothing. She thought about it for 11 days. Not continuously. She had a job to do and a bus to catch, and a nursing school anatomy exam to study for. But it was there, underneath everything, turning over. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about Vivienne's finger pointing at her. She thought about the laughter. She thought about Graham's voice on the phone, telling her the optics weren't right. She thought about the rent notice that had come in the mail on day 7, which was more aggressive than the previous ones. She thought about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs for 15 years and died before she was 60 of a kind of exhaustion that never showed up on the death certificate. She thought about herself in 30 years, if nothing changed. On day 12, she called the number on the card. He answered on the second ring. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. She had written them out. Not because she needed the paper, she had memorized every word, but because she wanted to read them out loud from something physical, something that made them real. She read them slowly and precisely. Separate rooms, no physical expectations, no surveillance, no control over her friendships or clothing or food or career decisions, no use of her race or her body or her financial circumstances as leverage, and the right of either party to walk away if trust was broken. He was quiet while she spoke. When she finished, he said, "Those are reasonable." "I know they are." "Is that everything?" She thought for a moment. "Then in public, we protect each other." Another pause, shorter than the last one. "Always," he said. She looked at the list in her hand. She thought, clearly and without romanticism, about what she was agreeing to. Not because it was easy. Because it was survivable, and because she was good at surviving, and because the alternative was to continue doing it without any margin at all. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. That was how Imani Bellrose agreed to marry the most feared man in Chicago. Not in a ballroom. Not in a restaurant. On a phone call, in her apartment, standing in her kitchen with a handwritten list, and her mother's practicality in her blood, and the full understanding that whatever came next, she was walking into it with her eyes open. She was wrong, of course. But she didn't know that yet. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday. Not romantic paperwork, not the kind with embossed lettering and ribbon. A manila folder delivered by a man named Dominic Serrano, who introduced himself as Roman's consigliere and had the particular energy of someone who had spent 20 years solving problems that other people had created. He was compact, dark-haired, 50-something, with eyes that moved around a room before his body did. He sat across from Imani at her kitchen table and placed the folder between them like he was making a move in a game. She hadn't agreed to play yet. "This is the contract," he said. "I see that. You should have someone review it." "I will. Do you have a lawyer?" She looked at him flatly. "Do I look like I have a lawyer, Dominic?" He didn't blink. "Roman will provide one if you need. I'll find my own." She pulled the folder toward her side of the table. Anything else? He studied her for a moment in a way that was less invasive than thorough, like he was cataloging something. You're not afraid of him, he said. It came out more like an observation than a compliment. Should I be? Most people are. Most people probably have more to lose than I do. She stood, which was a clear signal, and Dominic Serrano, whatever else he was, had the social intelligence to read it. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and moved toward the door, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never been rushed anywhere in his adult life. At the door, he paused. The wedding date is in 3 weeks. Small ceremony civil, nothing public. The announcement will follow. He said it the way someone reads a weather forecast. Informational. Inevitable. Roman didn't mention a timeline. Roman doesn't always mention timelines. He said it without apology. He'll call you this evening. Roman did call. At 7:14 while she was eating reheated rice and reading through the contract with a yellow highlighter and a pen she'd borrowed from work. She let it ring twice not to make a point, just because she was in the middle of a sentence and then answered. 3 weeks, she said before he could speak. Yes, that's fast. I know. What's the urgency? A pause. Not evasive, more like someone deciding how much of the real answer to give. There's a family agreement about succession. My grandfather is ill. The timeline is his, not mine. She put the highlighter down. You're telling me there's a deadline. Yes. And you didn't mention this when you made the offer. No. She stared at the contract for a moment. Outside her window, the city did its ordinary evening thing traffic. Someone's music from the apartment above, a car alarm starting and stopping. That's a significant thing to leave out, Roman. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you knew you had a deadline, and you chose not to include it, which means you were managing what I knew in order to get a particular answer. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she almost spoke again. Then yes, that's what I did. She hadn't expected the directness. It caught her somewhere she hadn't prepared. Why tell me now? Because you'd figure it out anyway. And you should know before you sign. She looked at the contract. Page 7 had a clause about the duration 1 year from the date of signing, and now she understood why it was phrased the way it was. The year wasn't arbitrary. The year was about someone's grandfather, and something old and binding that she was about to step into the middle of. I need 2 more days to review this, she said. You have them. And I want the lawyer you mentioned, not to negotiate against you, to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to. I'll send someone tomorrow morning. A woman, she said. Send a woman, another pause. All right, the lawyer's name was Patricia O.C., Nigerian-American. 50s, the kind of sharp that had been sharpened by decades of environments that hadn't expected it. She spent 3 hours with Imani going through every clause. She flagged 2 things, a confidentiality provision that was broader than necessary, and a vague clause about public conduct that could theoretically be used to constrain Imani's behavior. Imani sent both back to Roman's team with a single message, revise or I don't sign. Both were revised within 24 hours. She signed on a Thursday afternoon in Patricia's office with a notary present, and Dominic Serrano sit across the table looking as if he were witnessing a moderately interesting business transaction. Technically, he was. The civil ceremony was 11 days later. A judge's office downtown, 2 witnesses Dominic on Roman's side, Imani's best friend Kezia on hers, and a process that took 14 minutes from start to finish, including the judge mispronouncing Imani's last name once and correcting himself. Roman placed a ring on her finger that was simple and expensive, the kind of thing chosen by someone who understood that both simplicity and expense communicate things. She had not brought a ring for him. She hadn't known she was supposed to. He had apparently anticipated this and produced a plain band that went on his left hand without commentary. You could have told me, she said quietly, while the judge was signing something. You had enough to prepare, he said. That's not your call. He looked at her. You're right. I'm sorry. The apology was clean. No hedge, no performance. She filed it away. Kezia, who had been making an extremely disciplined effort to not visibly react to anything for the past 14 minutes, lost her composure in the elevator on the way down. Imani Bellrose. She grabbed Imani's left hand and looked at the ring with an expression that oscillated rapidly between alarm and wonder. You married a man, I'm aware. A specific man. The man who just walked out of that office. Kezia. I have done extensive research on Roman Calder over the past 11 days, and I need you to know that I support you completely, and also I haven't slept." Imani laughed despite herself. It came out of her, like something that had been waiting for permission. "I know what I'm doing." Kezia looked at her with the particular gaze of someone who has been her friend long enough to know exactly when that sentence is and isn't true. "Do you, though?" Imani didn't answer that one. Moving into the Calder estate was a logistics problem she approached as such. She packed 2 suitcases and 3 boxes because she didn't want to move more than she could move back out, because she had not allowed herself to forget that the arrangement had an end date. Roman's housekeeper, a woman named Elena, who communicated primarily through raised eyebrows and had clearly been running this household since before Roman's voice had finished changing, showed her to the east wing without apparent judgment. The rooms were large. The bed was larger than her previous bedroom. There was a window seat that looked over a courtyard where something leafy struggled gamely against the November cold. Elena paused at the door. "Mr. Calder's rooms are in the north wing. Separate floor." "Good," said Imani. Elena's eyebrow went up. Then she left. The announcement went out 4 days after the ceremony. A 2-paragraph statement from Roman's corporate office confirming the marriage, including a formal photograph taken by a photographer who had spent 45 minutes getting the lighting exactly right in a room Imani had never been in before that morning. In the photograph, she was standing beside Roman in a deep green dress that had been selected by someone whose job it was to select things, and she looked, people would say this repeatedly in the weeks that followed, like she belonged there. Not because the dress was expensive, because of how she was standing, like the room had always been hers. She did not feel that way on the inside, but she had learned early that feelings and posture were separate competencies. The reaction was immediate and not entirely warm. She found out about the whispers from Kezia, who had created a small private alert system and was feeding Imani information with the efficiency of a field correspondent. Chicago's social media was divided between people who were fascinated, people who were outraged on unspecified grounds, and people who said things about Imani's appearance and background that Kezia read aloud, with increasing creative profanity on Imani's behalf. The family was a different situation. The first Calder dinner happened 8 days after the announcement. A private affair at the estate Roman's mother, his aunt and uncle, 2 cousins whose names Imani memorized in advance, and Lucian. Imani had heard the name once briefly, mentioned by Dominic in passing. She had filed it without context. She understood more now. Roman's cousin, older by 2 years, had been considered a likely successor to the Calder organization before Roman's grandfather made his preference clear. This information she had assembled herself from 3 conversations and a careful attention to what wasn't said. She dressed carefully. Not elaborately, she had no interest in performing for this particular audience, but deliberately. She wore her own clothes, chosen by herself, and she arrived in the dining room with her shoulders level and her hands quiet. Roman's mother, Catherine, was a woman in her early 60s, who moved through spaces like she was cataloging them. She greeted Imani with a handshake rather than an embrace and said, "Roman tells me you're in nursing school," with the inflection of someone who finds the information interesting, but hasn't decided yet whether to approve. "Final year," Imani said. "That's demanding work." "It is." Catherine looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a woman who is doing a more sophisticated analysis than the conversation suggests. "Good," she said, and moved on. Lucian Calder was different. He was handsome in an architectural way, good bones, well-maintained, and he had the warm, engaged energy of someone who had practiced it long enough that it no longer required effort. He shook Imani's hand with both of his, smiled broadly, and said he was so glad to finally meet her. She didn't believe him. She couldn't have explained why, exactly. His behavior was impeccable. His words were appropriate. But there was something in his eyes, not hostility, not contempt, something more like measurement, like he was calculating something about her that had nothing to do with social pleasantry. She was pleasant back. She matched his warmth without exceeding it and watched him throughout the meal from her peripheral vision. The dinner itself was fine until one of the cousins, a captain in Roman's organization she'd gathered, named Carver, made the joke about the chair. It was delivered quietly to the man beside him, but Imani was close enough, and the table was not so large that it disappeared into the ambient noise. She heard it clearly. So did Roman. She watched Roman's hand, which had been resting on the table, still completely. That particular stillness she'd come to recognize as the predecessor to something she didn't want to witness directly. She spoke before Roman could. "Don't worry about my chair," she said pleasantly, at a volume that carried. Her eyes found Carver's. "Worry about keeping yours." The table went quiet. Carver stared at her. He had the look of a man who had said things for years in rooms where nobody answered back, and was experiencing the specific disorientation of having that change. Lucian laughed a brief, genuine sound that she found more unsettling than the joke had been. "I like her," he said to Roman. "She's got edges." "Yes," Roman said. His voice was entirely neutral. His hand had relaxed. After dinner, when the family had dispersed into the sitting rooms and someone had produced scotch and the conversation had broken into smaller pieces, Roman found her near the window. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know. I know what you were going to do." She looked at him. And then everyone in that room would have the rest of the night thinking about Carver and what you said to him. Instead, they're thinking about what I said, which is better for both of us. Roman looked at her for a moment. "You thought all of that through in 3 seconds. I've had a lot of practice at rooms where I'm not welcome." He didn't have anything to say to that. She appreciated that he didn't try. The weeks that followed had a strange rhythm. She went to nursing school in the mornings, came back to the estate in the afternoon, studied in the library because it had better light than her room, and occasionally encountered Roman in the kitchen at hours that suggested neither of them slept as well as they pretended to. The first time she found him there, 11:45 on a Wednesday, standing at the stove with what appeared to be catastrophic intentions toward a pan of eggs, she stood in the doorway, long enough to watch the situation develop before she said anything. "What is happening?" she said. He looked at the pan. He looked at her. "I'm making eggs." "You're not, though. They'll be fine." She came into the kitchen and looked at the pan. The eggs were she wasn't sure how. Technically, eggs achieved this simultaneously overcooked on the outside and structurally unsound in the middle. "How long have you been doing this?" 12 minutes. "Roman," she took the pan handle. "Move." He moved. She fixed the eggs. She also made toast, which he watched with the focused attention of someone observing a skill that had eluded him. She set the plate in front of him and sat across the island with her own cup of tea. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Just don't set fire to anything tomorrow night." He ate. She drank her tea. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the wind was doing something aggressive to the courtyard trees, and it was, Imani recognized, the most genuinely comfortable she had felt in this house since she arrived. She was not going to let herself make too much of that. Things shifted in the 3rd week. It started with the charity gala, a children's hospital fundraiser that was apparently an annual fixture on the Calder family calendar and required Roman's attendance as a primary donor. Imani was expected to attend with him. She had no objection to that particular event. The cause was straightforward, and she had done volunteer work at pediatric clinics before nursing school. What she had not anticipated was Vivienne Cross. Vivienne was there in her professional capacity. Her family's pharmaceutical company was a sponsor, and she arrived approximately 20 minutes after Imani and Roman, which meant Imani saw her before Vivienne saw her, which meant Imani had time to compose her face into something entirely neutral. Roman noticed the shift. He didn't say anything immediately, just moved slightly closer in the way that could be read as a husband being attentive, and also communicated something else entirely. "Don't," Imani said quietly. "I'm not doing anything. You were about to do something." He paused. "She shouldn't be here. She has every right to be here. Her family's company is a sponsor." Imani took a glass of water from a passing server and kept her eyes forward. "I am not going to spend the evening performing distress for your benefit. That's not what Roman." She looked at him directly. "I can handle Vivienne Cross. What I can't handle is you treating me like I need to be handled." He was quiet for a moment. "Understood." Vivienne spotted them approximately 10 minutes later. The process of her face rearranging itself, shock, calculation, recovery, took maybe 4 seconds and was, Imani thought, technically impressive. She crossed the room with the practiced ease of someone for whom social navigation was a competitive sport. "Roman," she kissed the air near his cheek. She turned to Imani with a smile that was architecturally perfect and emotionally empty. "Imani, What a lovely surprise, Vivienne. Imani's voice was pleasant, completely pleasant. Beautiful event, isn't it? I was just saying to Marcus that the organization this year has been particularly. She let the sentence drift as her eyes moved, briefly but deliberately, across Imani from collar to hem. You look wonderful, she said with the specific warmth that means its opposite. Thank you, said Imani, so do you. Roman had gone very still beside her. Vivienne continued, redirecting. I've been meaning to call. There's a matter about the Foundation's spring calendar that I thought you and I might. Send it to Dominic's office, Roman said. His voice was perfectly civil, completely closed. A pause. Something moved behind Vivienne's eyes. Of course. She smiled at Imani again, the same architectural smile. Enjoy the evening, she moved away. Imani exhaled. I told you, Roman said very quietly. She shouldn't be here. Stop, Imani, I said stop. She turned to look at him fully. You're angry on my behalf, I understand that. But I was fine. I handled it. Don't make this about your anger. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Short. She looked back across the room to where Vivienne had rejoined a cluster of sponsors, and she thought, not for the first time, about the ballroom, about the bracelet, about the calculated precision of what Vivienne had done that night, not impulsive cruelty, but deliberate performance. She thought about Lucian's eyes at the dinner table, the way he had measured her. She thought about the pattern of it. 2 weeks later, she brought it to Roman. Not directly, she didn't have enough yet for direct. She was in the library, and he came in looking for something, and she said, without prelude, shipping losses has your organization had in the last 6 weeks. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Where did that come from? How many? A pause. Several. The dock workers who come into the community clinic where I volunteer, she said carefully. 3 of them in the last month. All with injuries from what they described as accidents. All at Calder-connected warehouses. The date she had written them on a notepad, which she slid across the table toward him, correspond to the losses Dominic mentioned at your last meeting, which I was present for approximately 4 minutes of before you sent me out. Roman looked at the notepad. He looked at her. Something in his face had changed. How long have you been tracking this? He said. Since the first dock worker came in. About 5 weeks. You didn't say anything. I wasn't sure it was anything. She sat back. Now I'm more sure. He picked up the notepad. His jaw had tightened. She watched him read the dates twice. Stay out of this, he said. She had expected that. I'm not in it. I'm handing you information. Imani. He set the notepad down. This isn't. You don't understand what you're looking at. Then explain it to me. It's not safe to explain it to you. She stood. You agreed that you would not dictate my actions. You agreed that I had the right to move through this world without your control. And now I am handing you something useful, which I arrived at on my own, from my own work. And you are trying to protect me in a way that treats me like I'm a problem to be managed. That's not what I'm doing. What are you doing? He met her eyes. There was something there she had not seen before, not anger, not the controlled authority he wore everywhere else. Something closer to genuine fear, though it wore a mask. Whoever is doing this, he said slowly, is inside my organization. Which means the people closest to me might not be safe. Which means I'm already in this, she said. I married you. That's not reversible. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight. Let me handle this, he said finally. Not because I'm managing you. Because if you get any closer to it, you become a target. And I cannot. He stopped. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. She looked at him for a long moment. The man standing across the library table from her was not the man from the ballroom, not entirely, and he was not the man who had sat across from her in the diner with the clinical proposal. He was something else. Something she hadn't had a name for yet and wasn't ready to find one. All right, she said. You handle it. She left the library. In the hallway, she stopped and stood with one hand against the wall and breathed carefully because her heart was doing something inconvenient, and she was not ready to examine why. 3 days later, Roman's convoy was hit on the west side. She found out the way she found out most things about his world, not from him, but from the shape of the house afterward. Elena moving faster than usual. Dominic arriving before 7 in the morning and going directly to Roman's study. 3 men in the East Wing corridor who had not been there before and who looked at her with the calibrated blankness of people in a professional posture she understood meant threat assessment. She found Roman in the study at 8:15. He was at his desk. He had a cut along the left side of his jaw that had been cleaned and closed with 2 small strips of medical tape, and someone had done a mediocre job of it. He looked up when she entered and did not tell her to leave. She crossed the room, went to the small first aid kit on the bookshelf that she had restocked herself 2 weeks ago because the previous contents had been expired, and came back to the desk. Sit still. It's fine. The tape is wrong. Sit still. He sat still. She removed the old strips carefully and reapplied them correctly, which required her to be close enough that she could feel the tension in him. Not pain, something else. The whole body braced. His hands were on the desk. She could see the knuckles. How many people were in the convoy? She said. 4. Anyone seriously hurt? Bruises. Grady has a concussion. She pressed the last strip into place. And you, I told you. It's fine. She stepped back. She looked at him. He looked back. It was Lucian, she said. The room went very still. Roman's expression did not change, but something behind it did, some internal structure shifting. What makes you say that? The dinner, she said. He measured me, not the way the others were hostile. They were hostile because they didn't want me here. He was interested, like I was information, like he was figuring out whether I was useful or dangerous to a plan he already had. She paused, and Vivian Cross is connected to him. They spoke for 11 minutes at the gala. I watched. Roman was very quiet. I'm right, she said. I don't know yet, he said. But she knew from the way he said it that he thought she was. That evening, for the first time since she had moved into the estate, Roman knocked on the door of her rooms. She opened it, and he was standing in the hallway, looking like a man who had arrived somewhere. He wasn't sure he should be. I'm going to need to ask you to be more careful, he said. Not because I'm controlling your movements, because I need to know you're aware of what's around you. I've always been aware of what's around me, she said. That's how I survived before you. He took that. Elena will accompany you on the clinic days, or someone I trust you choose. Elena, she said. I don't want someone who looks like security. He nodded. He turned to go. Roman. He stopped. The convoy, whoever planned it, knew your route, she said, which means they have someone inside. He turned back slowly. His face was controlled. His eyes were not. Yes, he said. How deep? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She stood in her doorway and watched him walk back down the hallway toward the north wing, and she felt something she recognized as the specific gravity of a situation becoming irreversible the moment you step far enough into something that the distance back and the distance forward are no longer meaningfully different. She had signed a contract. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she was clear-eyed and unsentimental, and that clarity was its own protection. She was in a house with a man whose enemies were now deciding she existed, and she had just handed him the name of the person who might be trying to destroy him, and he had looked at her with something she could not name, but felt somewhere below the surface of the word concern, and she had not moved away from it. She closed her door. She sat on the edge of her bed. Her phone had a message from Kezia. Call me when you can. Saw something online about the Calder convoy. You okay? She typed back. Fine. I'll call tomorrow. She set the phone down. She looked at her hands still steady, which she noted as a fact, without pride or relief. Outside the window, Chicago glittered in the dark with its ordinary indifference. Cars moved. Someone on another floor of the building across the courtyard was watching something loud on television. A siren somewhere, moving away. She had come here to survive. That was the arrangement. Survive the year, complete her degree, walk out with her debts paid, and her life intact. She had not agreed to this specific something she refused to name, this understanding that the man in the north wing was in danger and that the danger now knew her face. She had not agreed to care. She looked at the ring on her left hand. She had not agreed to care, and yet here she was in the dark, calculating routes from the clinic to the state, and thinking about a cut along someone's jaw, and knowing, with the specific clarity that arrived too late and without ceremony, that the contract she had signed and the thing she was actually in were no longer the same. She sat with that unfinished thought for a long time. The contract she had signed and the thing she was actually in were no longer the same. That was the sentence she hadn't let herself complete. She completed it now, alone in the dark, and then she set it aside, the way you set aside something fragile that you aren't ready to deal with yet. And she lay down on top of the covers without changing her clothes and stared at the ceiling until her eyes closed. She did not sleep well. Nobody in the estate did that week. The atmosphere had changed in the way that atmospheres change when something violent has been absorbed but not resolved, a pressure system sitting over the house. Present in the way Elena moved through the corridors without speaking. Present in the two new men stationed at the east entrance, whom Imani passed every morning without acknowledgement. Present in the sound of Roman's voice through the closed door of his study. Brief and clipped phone calls that started early and ended late. Dominic was there almost constantly. She would see him in the kitchen getting coffee at 6 in the morning, or in the hallway near the study, with a tablet in one hand and his eyes somewhere else entirely. He acknowledged her each time with a nod that communicated respect without warmth, which was the most she had expected from him, and more than she had initially hoped for. On the fourth day after the convoy attack, she was in the library studying when she heard raised voices through the wall, not distinguishable words. Just the shape of the exchange, Roman's voice, controlled but compressed, and another voice she didn't recognize that rose and then cut off sharply. Then silence, then the sound of a door. She kept her eyes on her anatomy text. She turned a page she hadn't finished reading. 10 minutes later, Roman walked into the library. He had the look of a man who had just made a decision that cost him something. "One of my captains," he said without preamble. "He's been redirecting shipments for 8 weeks. He didn't know who he was ultimately working for. He thought it was an independent operator." She looked up from the text, but it wasn't. "No, Lucian. We're not certain yet, Roman." He met her eyes. "We're building the case. Dominic needs documentation before I can move." She closed the book. "How many people in your organization know about the pattern I gave you?" 3. "Make it 2, she said. "Whatever you're building, tighten the circle." He looked at her for a moment. "Dominic said the same thing this morning." "Then Dominic is right." She reopened the book. "Go handle your situation. I have an exam on Thursday." He almost said something else. She could feel it, the shape of an unformed sentence hovering near him. Then he left. She stared at the same paragraph for 6 minutes before any of it registered. The charity gala for the Children's Hospital Foundation was 4 days later. She had agreed to attend weeks before the convoy, before the tightened security, before the specific weight that now lived in the house. She considered briefly backing out. She didn't. The foundational mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with Roman or appearances or the careful performance of their arrangement. She had volunteered at a pediatric clinic for 2 years. She had seen what insufficient resources looked like in a children's ward. If her presence at a fundraiser brought additional attention or dollars to that cause, then she was going to be present. She wore a dress she had chosen herself, deep burgundy, long, with a structured neckline. She did her own hair. She did not ask Elena for help or Roman for approval, and neither of them offered either. In the car on the way there, Roman said, "You don't have to stay the whole evening. I know. If at any point you want to leave, Roman." She turned to look at him. "I'm not leaving early. The auction portion starts at 9, and I want to be there for it." He nodded. He looked out his window. "You're worried," she said. "I'm cautious. You've been cautious for 6 days. It's starting to look like something else." He turned from the window. "What does it look like?" She considered, afraid. He didn't deny it. That, more than anything, was what caught her attention. The gala was at the Meridian, a hotel downtown that had spent a lot of money making sure its event spaces looked like places where money had always lived. The foundation's executive director greeted them near the entrance with the particular warmth of someone genuinely grateful for their presence rather than performing gratitude, which Imani appreciated. She spent 20 minutes with her, talking about the clinic expansion project, while Roman spoke with 2 aldermen nearby and kept her in his peripheral vision in a way she had decided to find endearing rather than stifling. The evening moved through its expected stages. Cocktail hour, seated dinner, remarks from the foundation's board chair, who was eloquent and mercifully brief. The auction was announced, and Imani leaned forward slightly in her seat, because the lot that mattered most was a dedicated year of mobile health screenings for underserved neighborhoods, and she had already decided what she was going to bid. She didn't win the lot, A man 3 tables over outbid her by $1,500, and she felt the specific frustration of a practical loss, not ego, just math. And then she caught Roman watching her and said quietly, "Don't." "I wasn't going to. You were calculating whether to intervene." He paused. "Yes, I don't want your money for this." "I know." "Then stop calculating." He uncalculated, as visibly as a man like Roman was capable of doing, and she looked back at the auction and let the frustration settle into something she could carry. She was at the dessert course when it happened. Not dramatically, not with any warning that she could have caught in advance. One moment she was lifting a fork, and the next moment the room had tipped sideways, not literally, but the sensation was close enough that she gripped the table edge with her free hand. The fork went down. She was aware, abstractly, that she had not eaten properly in 4 days. She was aware that she had been sleeping badly and studying hard and absorbing the pressure of the house's new atmosphere, while also attending the clinic twice that week. She was aware that her body had been presenting invoices for all of this for approximately 24 hours, and she had been declining to pay them. The body, in its infinite practicality, decided to collect regardless. She came back to full consciousness, having not entirely left it. She hadn't lost awareness. Just the organizational capacity to make sense of the room. And Roman's hand was on her arm, and his face was approximately 8 inches from hers, and had an expression on it that she had never seen before, and would spend considerable time afterward trying to name. "I'm fine," she said. "You are not fine. It's just I didn't eat enough today. I was studying, and I forgot." Imani, his voice was very quiet and very precise. "I'm taking you out of this room. The auction isn't. The auction is finished." He was already standing, and his hand had moved from her arm to her back, and she registered with the distant part of her brain that wasn't occupied with staying vertical that he was not asking. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood. The room remained approximately where it was supposed to be. "See, don't argue with me right now." "I'm not arguing, I'm demonstrating." But she let him guide her out. She told herself it was because the room had actually been too warm and because her exam was Thursday, and losing consciousness at a charity gala would compromise her ability to study for it, and not because his hand on her back felt like something solid in a week that contained very little that was. At the hospital, which she objected to, and he overruled with a single look at Dominic, who made a call the attending physician, found dehydration and exhaustion and no underlying emergency, administered fluids, and told her she needed to sleep and eat actual meals on a regular schedule like a human being. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't aware of that recommendation." The doctor, who had clearly developed thick skin around patient sarcasm, wrote something on a chart and left. Roman was in the chair beside the bed. He had not left. She was aware he had an emergency leadership meeting. That night she had overheard something about it 3 days ago, and she said, "You should go to your meeting," rescheduled. "Roman, Dominic is handling it." His voice was final without being hard. "Stop." She looked at the IV in her arm. She looked at the ceiling. She had a very specific feeling that she recognized as the feeling of having her logistics spurred by someone else's decision, which was the feeling she deeply disliked. And underneath it, separately, something that was not dislike at all. "You rescheduled an emergency meeting," she said. "Yes, because I forgot to eat lunch. Because you collapsed at a public event. And I'm your husband," he said simply. As a fact, as if the word carried its full weight and he intended it to. "Go to sleep." "I don't." She stopped. She was very tired. "You're infuriating. Sleep." She slept. When she woke, it was past 2 in the morning. The room was quiet and dimly lit, and Roman was asleep in the chair beside her bed, still in his gala clothes, with one hand resting on the edge of the mattress 6 inches from hers. She looked at him for a long time. He looked, asleep, like a man who had put down an enormous weight and had not yet remembered to pick it back up. The controlled stillness was gone. He was just a person in a chair who had fallen asleep without intending to, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and probably the most unguarded he allowed himself to be. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the window. She looked at the IV in her arm. She did not look at his hand on the mattress. She was discharged in the morning. On the drive back to the estate, she sat beside him in the back seat and said, out of nowhere, "Thank you." He looked at her. "For staying," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked back out the window. She looked out her own window. Neither of them said anything else, And the silence was not uncomfortable, and she noticed that too. 2 days later, Dominic came to find her in the library. He knocked, which she had come to understand was his version of significant effort. And when she said, "Come in," he entered and closed the door behind him, and stood with his hands clasped in front of him in a posture that said whatever he was about to say, he had considered it carefully. "I need you to understand something," he said. She put her pen down. "Sit down, Dominic." He sat, which also represented something. He had not sat in her presence in the library before. "Lucian has people watching the estate," he said. "Not aggressive surveillance. Soft. Logging arrivals and departures, who you see when Roman is away." He paused. "He's building a pressure profile, looking for the angle that does the most damage. She absorbed this. And you're telling me, because you're the angle." He said it without apology, which she respected. "You're the most visible vulnerability Roman has right now. If Lucian can damage the marriage publicly, structurally he can argue to the family council that Roman's leadership is compromised." Another pause. "He's going to come at you. I don't know how yet, but I want you informed." She looked at him. "Roman knows you're telling me this?" "No." "Why not go through him?" Dominic's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters. "Because Roman knows it intellectually, but he cannot quite treat you like a variable in a threat matrix, which is why he's better than his father was. A beat. And also why he needs someone else to have this conversation." She sat with that for a moment. "You've been running interference between him and his own instincts. That's part of the job. For how long?" 11 years. She looked at the window. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing specific. Awareness." He hesitated, which was the first time she had seen him hesitate. "Don't pull away from him right now, whatever the arrangement is or was. The stability of the appearance matters." "It's not just an appearance," she said, before she could stop herself. Dominic looked at her. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. "No," he said, "I can see that." He's left. She sat alone in the library for 20 minutes without picking up her pen. That was Tuesday. On Thursday, she took her anatomy exam, and she believed she had done well, though her ability to evaluate her own performance was somewhat undermined by the fact that she had spent the night before reviewing notes with one part of her brain, while the other part cataloged what Dominic had told her and rearranged the pieces of the last several weeks into a shape she was only now seeing clearly. Lucian was building a case. The shipments, the captains, the convoy, those were practical attacks on Roman structure. But she was the psychological attack. The marriage was the pressure point. She understood this the way she understood anatomy, not theoretically, but as a set of concrete relationships between parts. If the marriage fractured, Roman's leadership's claim fractured. If Roman's leadership was seen as compromised, the family council could move. If the council moved, Lucian had his opening. She was the bracelet this time. The thought arrived cleanly and without drama, and sat in her chest with a cold, specific weight. She went back to the estate after the exam. She ate dinner alone because Roman was in a meeting that had started at 4, and Dominic had texted Elena to say it would run late. She washed her own dishes. She sat in the kitchen after, and drank tea, and thought about the shape of what she was in. Roman found her there at 9:15. He had the look of a man who had spent 5 hours in a room with people he didn't entirely trust, making decisions he couldn't entirely control. "How was the exam?" he said. "Fine." She looked up. "How was your meeting?" "Productive." He went to the cabinet for a glass, filled it with water, drank half of it standing at the sink. "Did you eat?" she said. He looked at the glass. "No." She got up and went to the refrigerator. She's assembled something leftover rice, chicken that Elena had prepared that morning, whatever vegetables presented themselves, and put it in front of him without ceremony. He sat, he ate. She sat across from him with her tea. This was, she realized, the 4th or 5th time they had done some version of this late kitchen, quiet, the ordinary mechanics of 2 people occupying the same space without performance. It had become a thing that happened. She wasn't sure when. "Dominic told me about the surveillance," she said. Roman set his fork down. "He was right to," she said, before he could respond. "Don't be angry with him." "I'm not angry with him." His voice was even but tighter than it had been. I should have told you myself." "Why didn't you?" The silence lasted 3 seconds, which from Roman was practically a speech. "Because telling you makes it real in a specific way." He stopped. "I'm what?" He looked at his plate, then at her. You're not supposed to be in the middle of this. And yet, she kept her voice steady. Here's the thing, Roman. I am in the middle of it. That's not going to change because you manage what I know. And if Lucian is going to come at me, I need to be able to see it coming. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she had no precise word. For it was somewhere between frustration and something much older, something that had to do with wanting and not knowing how to have. All right, he said. I'll tell you what I know. He told her. Not everything. She was not naive enough to think he edited nothing, but more than she had expected. The captain who had been redirecting shipments was talking now, and what he was saying connected 3 incidents over 8 weeks in a chain that traced back to a shell company registered in Delaware that Dominic's people had found this morning. The shell company had 1 officer listed, not Lucian's name, someone 2 steps removed from Lucian. But the direction was clear. How long before you can move on him? She asked. Dominic says 2 weeks, maybe less. She nodded. She thought about Dominic's warning. Whatever the arrangement is, don't pull away. What do you need from me in the meantime? He looked at her as if the question had surprised him somehow. Nothing you're not already doing. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a moment. Be careful, he said. Another pause, shorter. Don't disappear. She met his eyes. I won't, she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The kitchen was warm. The city outside was doing its nocturnal business. At some point, she had stopped being aware of the noise it made unless she paid attention to it. And she paid attention to it now just to have somewhere to look that wasn't his face. She got up and rinsed her mug. Finish eating, she said. You look terrible. Thank you. It's not a compliment. She put the mug on the rack. Good night. She went to her room. She changed into actual pajamas for once. She got into bed with the lights on and stared at the nursing textbook on her nightstand and did not open it. She was thinking about what Dominic had said and what Roman had said and the shape of the thing she was inside and the distinction increasingly difficult to locate between the contract she had signed and the actual decisions she was making about her actual life. She was thinking about the ring on her left hand. She turned out the light. She was 4 days from the worst moment of her life, and she didn't know it. It arrived on a Monday. She came home from the clinic at 4:15 with Elena, who had proven to be excellent company in the specific way of a woman who communicated primarily through very precise silences and the occasional devastating observation. They rode in comfortable quiet. Imani was tired in the good way, the way of having been useful, of having done something real with her hands and her training and her attention. There was a package in her room, not left with Elena or at the front entrance or anywhere a package should arrive, on her bed, inside the estate, which meant someone had put it there. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. A manila envelope, thick, unsealed, with her name written on the front in a generic printed font from a label maker. She put down her bag. She did not open it immediately. She took a breath, and she thought about what she was likely looking at, and she thought about Dominic's warning, and then she opened it. Bank statements. Her bank statements, from before the marriage, 8 months of them, annotated in red marker. Eviction notices, both of them, with dates circled. Her employment history for the past 3 years, printed from what had to be a background check database. Copies of her student loan statements. The gap months marked. The month she had worked 3 jobs simultaneously, marked. The week before the Calder estate event, the balance in her account, $43, circled twice. She went through every page. At the bottom of the stack was a single printed note, plain font, no signature. Ask your husband when he had this file compiled. Ask him if he made the offer because he respected you, or because he already knew exactly how desperate you were. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a long time. The light changed. The room got darker as the afternoon moved into early evening. She did not turn on a lamp. She sat in the dimming room with the file on her lap and let herself feel, with full precision and without insulation, exactly what it was she was feeling. She had known he investigated her. He had told her that in the diner. He had said he had someone look into her. She had been angry about it, and she had asked him directly whether he'd chosen her because her circumstances made her desperate enough to accept. And he had explained himself, and she had not forgiven, exactly, but continued. She had decided to continue. What she had not known was the scale of it. This was not someone checking her background for safety. This was a dossier. This was a detailed mapping of the architecture of her vulnerability, every gap, every shortfall, every month. She had barely held it together. Someone had compiled this with the specific intention of understanding exactly how much pressure a person could be under before they would say yes to something they'd otherwise refuse. She thought about Roman in the diner, the calm of him, the certainty. He had known when he sat across from her exactly how thin her margin was. He had known before he walked through the door. He had known, and he had made the offer anyway, and he had never, not in any conversation they had since, mentioned the depth of what he'd looked at. She thought about the kitchen, the eggs, the hospital, his hand on the edge of the mattress. Don't disappear. She thought about all of it. Then she picked up her phone and texted him, "Come to my room when you're free." He knocked 11 minutes later, which meant he hadn't been far. She said, "Come in," and he opened the door and looked at her sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, and the first thing he did was reach for the light switch. "Leave it," she said. He left it. He looked at the papers on her lap. He went very still. She watched his face in the low light from the window. He recognized what she was holding. She saw the recognition move through him, not surprise, which would have told her something different, but a specific quality of dread that told her he had known this moment was possible and had been unable to prevent it. "When did you have this compiled?" she said. "Before I came to the diner." His voice was level. He was not going to perform innocence. She gave him credit for that and took nothing else from it. All of it. She lifted the stack slightly. The eviction notices, the account balance, the loan statements. "Yes. You knew to the week how close I was to losing everything." "Yes." The word sat between them. "When you made the offer," she said, "when you sat across from me and told me it was a business proposal, you already knew that I couldn't afford to say no. I believed you could make the decision clearly, regardless of your circumstances," he said. "That is not an answer to what I said." He was quiet. "Roman." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "Did you choose me because you saw something worth choosing? Or did you choose me because a broke, fat, black woman who had just been publicly humiliated and fired was the safest possible version of desperate?" The silence stretched. "Both," he said. She looked at him. At first he said, "Yes, both. You were viable because of your circumstances, and I knew it, and I used it." He didn't look away. "And then I sat across from you, and you handed my money back and told me you weren't a charity case, and I understood that the circumstances were not who you were. But I still used them." She looked down at the papers. She felt something happening in her chest that she had been carefully preventing for weeks, some structural thing giving way that she had been bracing against, without admitting she was bracing. "I told myself," she said slowly, "that I was going into this with my eyes open. That I knew exactly what it was. And the whole time, you knew more about my life than I had told you, and you made the decision to use it. And you never, in all the conversations we've had, in the kitchen, in the hospital, in every single moment where I thought we were building something that at least resembled honesty." She stopped.
Imani.
She stood. The papers shifted, and she caught them and set them on the bed. "I need you to leave my room. Please let me, Roman." She looked at him directly, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop. "Leave my room." He left. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, measured and receding, and then silence. She stood in the dark for a long time. Then she went to her closet and got out the larger of her 2 suitcases and set it on the bed and opened it. She packed methodically. Not everything, only what was hers in the most original sense, the things she had brought from before. Her own clothes, her textbooks, the photographs of her mother she had put on the nightstand, her nursing school notebook, the small brass bracelet Kezia had given her 2 birthdays ago. She left the ring on the nightstand. She zipped the suitcase. She sat on the edge of the bed beside it. She was not going to leave tonight. It was 9 o'clock and she had nowhere to go until she called Kezia in the morning. But she needed the suitcase packed because she needed to see it. She needed the physical evidence that she was capable of leaving. That she had not, despite all evidence to the contrary, completely lost herself in the architecture of this. She looked at the ring. She thought about Vivian's clutch. She thought about the ballroom and Roman's voice search everyone. And she thought about how certain she had been, in that moment, that he was different. She thought about being wrong. Outside her door, the hallway was completely silent. She lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, with the packed suitcase beside her on the bed, and she stared at the ceiling and understood that the contract was over. And the question of what that meant for every other thing she had been pretending not to feel was the most frightening question she had encountered in a very long time, and the only way through it was the way she had always gotten through things that were frightening. One step, then the next. She closed her eyes, and somewhere in the North Wing, the most feared man in Chicago sat in the dark with the full knowledge that the one thing he had never been afraid to lose was gone. The word sat in the dark of the North Wing like something with physical weight. Roman Calder, who had sat across from dying men without his hands shaking, who had made decisions that ended careers and freedoms, and occasionally lives with the same flat affect he brought to financial reports, sat in the chair by his window and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to have done something that could not be strategized around. He had not lied to her. That was the part that kept turning over. He had not invented a version of events. When she asked him directly, he had said both, because that was the truth, and the truth had taken everything. He sat there until 4 in the morning. Then he went to his desk and worked, because there was nothing else to do, and Dominic needed the documentation on the shell company by 6, and because Roman Calder did not know how to stop moving. Stopping was the thing that let the worst thoughts catch up. He was still at the desk when Elena knocked at 5:45 and told him, with the particular careful neutrality she reserved for information he was not going to like, that Imani had asked her to arrange a car for 8 o'clock. He looked up from the desk. Where to? She didn't specify. She asked for the car. A pause. She has a packed bag, Mr. Calder. He was quiet for a moment. Arrange the car. Elena left. He looked at the documents on his desk, and they meant nothing for approximately 90 seconds. And then he assembled himself back into something functional and kept working, because the alternative was to go to her door and say things she wasn't ready to hear, and do exactly what she had accused him of using pressure instead of patience. He arranged the car. He did not go to her door. He heard her leave at 8:14. The estate felt different after that. Not quieter, the security personnel were still present. Dominic arrived at 9, with 3 other men and a table full of documents. The house operated exactly as it always had. But something structural was absent, in a way that Roman noticed constantly and said nothing about. Dominic noticed his noticing, and also said nothing about it, which was one of the reasons he had been invaluable for 11 years. At 10 that morning, Dominic spread the final documentation across the conference table in the East Study and walked Roman through it with the methodical precision of a man presenting a case he had built brick by brick over weeks. The shell company traced to a holding entity in the Cayman Islands. The holding entity had 3 principals, 2 of whom were financial ghosts' identities that existed on paper and nowhere else. The third was a man named Garrett Foss, who had been Lucian Calder's personal attorney for 9 years, and who had also, according to 3 separate financial forensics trails, processed the payments that went to the corrupted captains. That's the chain, Dominic said. Foss to the captains. Captains to the dock operations to the competitor networks that received the redirected shipments. He tapped a photograph. And Foss doesn't make a move like this without explicit direction. His entire professional existence depends on Lucian. Roman looked at the photograph of Foss. Mid-50s, forgettable face, the kind of man whose entire value was in being unnoticed. What does Lucian know about what we have? Nothing yet. He knows the captain got picked up, but we've managed the communication. Lucian thinks it's an internal discipline matter, not a forensic investigation. How long does that hold? Days, maybe less. Dominic straightened. We need to move before he realizes we have the chain. Once he knows, he'll start burning evidence, and we lose the documentation. Roman looked at the table, at the photographs and the bank transfers and the recorded calls and the chain of it. 8 weeks of betrayal laid out in clean documentary order. Set the meeting. The full council. I want every senior captain present. That'll signal to Lucian that something's happening. Good. Roman looked up. I want him to know something's happening. I want him in that room thinking he's about to win. Dominic studied him. And the succession matter. Without the marriage being... He paused, choosing words with the care of a man walking a narrow ledge. Without the marriage presenting as stable, the council has grounds to question the succession agreement regardless of the Lucian situation. Roman was quiet. Roman. I know. You need her there. I know that too. He turned from the table. Set the meeting for Thursday evening. The Meridian's private floor. And Dominic, he stopped at the door. Don't contact Imani. I'll handle that. And if you can't. Roman looked back at him. Then I can't. He drove to Kezia's apartment himself. No driver, no security detail, following at a discreet distance, just Roman in his own car, which he drove less often than people assumed, navigating the south side on a Tuesday morning. He had the address from a contact and he used it, without examining too closely what that said about him. He parked on the street. He sat in the car for 3 minutes. He got out. The building was a 3-flat with a security door that buzzed when he pressed the button for 2B. There was a long pause, and then Kezia's voice through the intercom, carefully neutral. Who is it? Roman Calder. A longer pause, then. She knows you're here? No. The longest pause yet. Then the door buzzed open, which told him something about Kezia that he filed with respect. She was waiting in the doorway of 2B with her arms crossed, and an expression that he categorized immediately as protective fury controlled, deliberate, but entirely present. She was small and wore her hair in a way that looked both effortless and intentional, and she looked at him the way people look at things they haven't decided about yet. She's in the kitchen, Kezia said. She didn't move from the doorway. I don't know yet. She looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had clearly been Imani's person for long enough to know exactly what she was evaluating. She cried last night. Imani Bellrose, who I have known for 11 years and who I have never once seen cry at a kitchen table, sat at my kitchen table and cried for 40 minutes. So before I let you walk in there, I need you to understand what that means. Roman stood on the landing and understood that he was being told something important and that the correct response was to receive it rather than to manage it. I understand, he said. Do you? No, he said. But I want to. Kezia studied him. Then she stepped aside. Imani was at the kitchen table with a coffee mug and a nursing textbook open in front of her, which Roman recognized immediately as a defensive posture. The textbook was there to communicate that she was fine and occupied rather than because she was actually studying. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her face went through several things very quickly. Then it settled into something level and controlled. She looked exhausted, the kind that sleep doesn't touch. You should have called, she said. You wouldn't have answered. She didn't deny it. She looked at the coffee mug. Kezia, can you? I'll be in my room, Kezia said, from behind him, with the tone of someone who will absolutely be able to hear everything. She disappeared down the hallway. Roman came into the kitchen. He did not sit. He stood near the counter, and he looked at her, and he said, I'm not here to ask you to come back. She looked up. I'm here because you deserve to hear the rest of it, he said, before the council meeting Thursday. Before whatever happens next. You deserve the full version. She was quiet, watching him with those dark eyes that had looked at him in the ballroom without flinching. They weren't flinching now either. They were doing something harder, waiting. When I first had the file compiled, he said, it was exactly what you think it was. Strategic information. I needed someone who would accept the arrangement, who had reasons to accept it, and who presented a particular kind of stability. Someone whose history I could verify and whose desperation I could calibrate. He said the word the way it deserved to be said, plainly, as the ugly thing it was. That was the calculation. She said nothing, and then I sat across from you in the diner, and you handed the money back, and I realized that the file had told me your circumstances, and nothing about you. And the circumstances were the least interesting thing in the room. He looked at her. I should have told you the full extent of what I knew before you signed anything. That was a choice I made to protect the outcome I wanted, and it was wrong. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the apartment, a radiator made a sound. I know that doesn't fix it, he said. No, she said. It doesn't. I know. He picked up nothing. He didn't move toward her. There's a count meeting Thursday. Dominic has the full evidentiary chain on Lucian. We can remove him from the organization and hand his independent criminal operations to federal intermediaries. It ends his ability to threaten anyone inside or outside the family. A pause. I need you to know that this happens regardless of what you decide. I'm not using it as leverage. Then why are you telling me? Because you've been a target in this for weeks, and you have the right to know it's almost over. She looked at him. Something moved through her face, not softening. Something more complicated than that. What happens to the succession if I don't come back? It goes to Lucien, or I sign it over voluntarily. And you'd sign it over. He met her eyes. Yes. She sat with that. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him differently, not skeptically. Just differently, with the attention of someone waiting for something real. Because the alternative is finding another arrangement. And I'm not willing to do that. He said it quietly, without decoration. I'm not willing to replace you. The words sat in the kitchen. She looked down at the textbook. She turned one page slowly, and then didn't read it. You should go, she said. I need to think. I know. He moved toward the doorway. He stopped. He did not turn around because some things were said without watching each other's face. The hospital night, he said. When you woke up and I was asleep in the chair, I wasn't there because of the succession arrangement or the appearances or anything contractual. He paused. I was there because the idea of leaving was not something I was capable of. He left. In the hallway, he passed Kezia's door, which was not entirely closed, which he had fully expected. He drove back to the estate, and he called Dominic, and he said, Thursday. Make sure every senior captain gets the summons personally. No deputies. Then he sat in his study and looked at the documentation for the rest of the day, and he did not allow himself to think about whether she would come, because thinking about it was a luxury, and Thursday was 2 days away, and there was too much left to build. Imani sat in Kezia's kitchen for a long time after the sound of the door. Kezia appeared in the doorway 9 minutes later with a fresh mug of coffee that she set down without comment, and then sat across the table with her own. And they were quiet together in the way they'd been quiet together. For 11 years, the kind of quiet that was its own complete conversation. Say it, Imani said finally. I'm not going to say anything. Kezia, I'm not. She wrapped her hands around her mug. It's your life. It's your call. I will support whatever you decide. But there is no but. There is only... Kezia looked at her carefully. He drove here himself. Did you notice that? No car, no security. Just him. A pause. I looked out the window when he left. Imani looked at her coffee. He sat in his car for 3 minutes before he got out. Kezia said. I watched. He just sat there. Imani was quiet. That's all I'm going to say, Kezia said. The rest is yours. She thought about it for 2 days. She went to her nursing school practicum on Wednesday and focused on the patients in front of her with the total absorption that had always been her best quality in clinical settings, the ability to be entirely present for the person who needed her. Attention, regardless of what was happening in the rest of her life. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. On the bus home, she thought about the file. She thought about what he had said in the kitchen calibrate and how he had said it, as an indictment of himself. Without softening, she thought about the chair beside the hospital bed, the hand on the mattress. She thought about what she knew about herself, which was this. She was not a person who let herself be used. She was also not a person who discarded things because they had started badly. The question of which of those two truths applied here was the one she had been turning over for 48 hours. And by Wednesday evening, she had an answer, and the answer frightened her a little. And she sat with the fright and let it be present, and then made the decision anyway. She called Dominic at 8 o'clock Wednesday night. What time Thursday, she said, a pause. 7. The Meridian, 23rd floor. I'll be there at 6:30. She hung up. She sat on the edge of Kezia's couch and looked at her hands. She called Roman. He answered on the first ring. I'll be there, she said. But I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to the estate after. This is for the council meeting and for the end of the Lucien situation. And after that, we renegotiate everything from the beginning. From scratch. No file, no arrangement, no deadline. If there's something real, it starts over. The line was quiet. Yes, he said, I mean it. I know you do. A pause. Thank you. She hung up. She looked at the wall. She thought about her mother, who had made practical decisions inside impossible circumstances, and entire called it living, because that was what it was. She allowed herself, just briefly, to be afraid of how much this particular practical decision had already cost her, and how much more it might. Then she went to bed. Thursday arrived, the way significant days arrive unremarkably, with ordinary morning light and ordinary sounds, indistinguishable from any other Thursday, until it wasn't. She dressed in her own clothes again, chosen by herself, a structured black dress, her own jewelry, her own shoes. She looked at herself in the mirror in Kezia's bathroom, and she looked like a woman who had decided something and wasn't going to undecide it. Kezia drove her to the Meridian. In the car, they didn't talk about Roman or the meeting or the council. They talked about Kezia's sister's new apartment
and a television show
they'd been watching separately, and whether the Greek place on 43rd was still open. Normal things. Necessary things. At the Meridian's entrance, Kezia put the car in park and turned to look at her. "You're the most capable person I know," Kezia said. "I just want you to know that. I know that." Imani leaned across and hugged her. Brief, tight. "I'll call you after," she said. She got out of the car. Dominic was in the lobby. He fell into step beside her without preamble. "Lucian is already upstairs," he said, voice low. "He doesn't know the nature of the meeting. He was told it was a succession formal he expects to walk out of that room with the organization. How many captains support him? 2, possibly 3. The rest are waiting to see how it lands." He paused as they reached the elevator. "Roman is in the room. He's been there since 6. The elevator doors closed. "The documentation is solid?" she said. "Airtight." She nodded. She looked at the elevator doors. "Mrs. Calder," Dominic said. She looked at him. He almost never used the name. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've worked for this family for 11 years. Roman is the first one who ever asked me whether the people we made decisions about understood the decisions being made about them." He looked at the floor indicator. "He asked me that question the morning after he came back from the diner. The night he made you the offer." The elevator stopped at 23. She filed that and walked out. The private floor of the Meridian was a suite of interconnected rooms that the Calder organization used for meetings that required both privacy and a level of formality that communicated seriousness. She had never been here before. It smelled like old money and recent cleaning products. She heard the room before she entered it, the ambient sound of a significant number of people in a space. The low-frequency tension of a gathering where everyone present understood that something was about to be resolved. Dominic pushed the door open. The room had 12 men in it. Senior captains, she assumed, based on age and bearing. Several she recognized from the family dinner. Some she had never seen. They were arranged in a configuration that suggested a formal proceeding, a long table, chairs on both sides, a position at the head. Lucian was on the left side of the table, 3 chairs from the head, and she saw in some moment he registered her entrance, because his entire composed, warm, architectural face did something it clearly hadn't prepared for. A fractional rearrangement. Something behind the warmth recalculating. Roman was standing near the windows. He looked at her when she walked in, and his face did not perform anything. It simply did what faces do when they see something they have been hoping to see, which was too specific and too honest to be useful to anyone performing. She met his eyes for a moment. Then she went and stood beside him. He said very quietly, near her ear, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, equally quiet. "Get to work." He turned to the room. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the most methodical demolition of a position Imani had ever witnessed in a non-medical context. Roman presented the documentation without theater. No raised voice, no dramatic pauses, just the chain of evidence laid out in sequential order, with Dominic managing the physical materials. Bank transfers, the shell company Foss, the captains, the sabotaged shipments, the convoy. Each piece connected to the next with the precision of something that had been built over weeks by people who understood that precision was the point. Several captains asked questions. Dominic answered them with the documentation. One captain tried twice to suggest alternative interpretations and was shut down the second time by a man across the table who had clearly done his own reading of the materials before the meeting. Lucian sat through all of it. He sat through it with a stillness that Imani recognized, because she had seen it on Roman, and it was a family trait, the ability to not move when everything in the body wants to. But Lucian's version had a different quality to it. Roman's stillness was its own kind of controlled strength. Lucian's was compression, something being held in that was looking for a direction to go. When the documentation was fully presented, Roman said, simply, "The floor is open." 2 captains spoke in Lucian's support. Their arguments were thin. One was essentially procedural, questioning the documentation's chain of custody, and the other was a character argument about Roman's judgment that died quickly when the man across the something sharp and brief that Imani didn't catch, but that had the intended effect. Then Lucian spoke. He had been sitting so still for so long that his voice, when it arrived, seemed louder than it was. "This is fabricated," he said. Warm voice, same as always. But the warmth now had a quality to it thinned out, stretched too far. Dominic built this chain from selective documentation, and Roman signed off on it because he's been distracted. His eyes moved to Imani. Distracted by something that has nothing to do with this organization. The room went quiet. Imani did not move. The succession agreement requires a legitimate family establishment, Lucian continued, still looking at her. And what Roman has established is a contractual performance. Everyone here knows it. An unknown woman with no connection to this world, brought in under a deadline to satisfy a clause. His voice was still controlled, still warm, but the warmth was fully cosmetic now, and anyone with functioning attention could hear it. "I've seen the dossier. We all know how this was arranged. Ask yourself, is a man who marries for strategy and calls it family qualified to lead this organization?" He was still looking at her. She looked back. The room was waiting for Roman. Roman stepped forward, and she saw in the set of his shoulders that he was about to say something that would handle the room and confirm his leadership and be, probably, exactly correct and strategically sound. And she knew with the specific knowledge of having watched him for months, that it would cost him something to say it, the particular cost of using the truth as a tool. She spoke first. "The dossier," she said. Her voice carried easily in the quiet room. "The one Lucian mentioned. The one that mapped out my financial circumstances before the arrangement was proposed." She looked at the captains around the table, not at Lucian, not at Roman, at the room. "I know about it. I've seen it, and I've had the conversation with my husband about what it means that he compiled it before we met." A pause. "We had that conversation, and it was not a comfortable one, and I did not come here tonight because it was resolved. I came here because the alternative was allowing a man who arranged sabotage and a convoy attack, and spent weeks trying to use me as a pressure point, to walk out of this room with something he tried to take through those methods." She turned to Lucian now. "You sent me that file," she said. "You put it on my bed inside this family's home, using access you arranged, through one of the captains you turned. You believed that I would leave, and the marriage would fracture, and Roman would be disqualified." She looked at him steadily. "You were almost right." Lucian's face was doing something now that was beyond his ability to fully contain. "Almost," she said. She stepped back. Roman was looking at her with an expression that had given up on being controlled. "The convoy attack," Roman said to the room. His voice was flat and final. "The corrupted captains, the shell company. The evidence is in front of you. Make your determination." The senior captain at the far end of the table, oldest in the room, who had said nothing until now, looked at Lucian for a long moment. Then he looked at the documentation. Then he said, "I've seen enough." Lucian's chair scraped back. He was on his feet before anyone had moved, and his hand went to his jacket. And every man in the room who had spent his life in environments where that gesture meant something specific reacted in the same instant, and there was a crash of motion at the right side of the table as two of Roman's men reached him before his hand cleared the fabric, and the room erupted into the exact controlled chaos of people who have trained for this specific moment. Imani did not move. She stood exactly where she was and watched Lucian get disarmed with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested it had been anticipated, because Roman had anticipated it, because Roman knew his cousin and had placed the right people in the right positions before the meeting started. Lucian was breathing hard, both arms held. His face had finally dropped the architecture entirely, and what was underneath was something raw and furious. And she thought, genuinely surprised that it had ended here, in a room with documentation and witnesses, and a woman he had tried to use as his demolition charge standing on the other side of the table and refusing to be demolished. "It's done," Roman said to him. Quiet. Final. Something that was not cruelty and was not pity, just the flat factual end of a thing. "It's over." Lucian said nothing. He had nothing left to say with. Roman spoke to the room, to the captains, to the structure of the thing that now had to be formally acknowledged. Lucian Calder is removed from every position, every alliance, and every connection to this organization as of tonight. The evidence of his independent operations will be delivered through the appropriate channels. He paused. This is not a discussion. No one discussed it. They took Lucian out of the room. The door closed. The remaining captains sat in the particular silence of people who have just witnessed the thing they came to see and are now processing its implications. The senior captain, at the far end of the table, looked at Roman. The succession agreement. I'm prepared to sign it over voluntarily, Roman said. If the council determines the circumstances. Sit down, Roman, the old man said, not unkindly. Something close to tired affection. Roman sat. The old captain looked around the table. He looked at the documentation. He looked at Imani, briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely classify, but which contained something that resembled respect. The council will vote, he said. The vote was not close. Afterward, when the captains had dispersed, and Dominic was managing the logistical aftermath with the quiet efficiency of a man for whom this was a practiced skill, Roman and Imani stood near the windows on the 23rd floor and looked out at Chicago doing what Chicago always did. Existing indifferently, glittering and cold, and entirely unconcerned with the resolution of succession disputes in its private upper floors. She was tired. Not the dehydration exhaustion of the gala, something deeper. The tiredness of a long thing coming to its end. You didn't have to do that, he said, in the room. I know. I know what Lucian was trying to do. She looked at the window. I chose to speak. Nobody asked me to. He was quiet for a moment. What you said? About almost. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with no performance left in his face at all, and she thought, as she had thought before, that he was most honest when he had nothing left to manage. I meant it, she said. I know. She looked back at the window. I meant what I said on the phone, too. About starting over. Yes. I'm not moving back into the estate, not yet. All right. And she paused. I need time with it. Not to punish you. Just to actually carry it and decide what it means for me. However long it takes. She looked at the city for a moment. The lights of it. The ordinary darkness between them. Somewhere out there was a diner on the south side and a bus stop and an apartment she had barely lived in and a nursing school with one semester left and a community clinic where people came with real problems that had real solutions if someone paid enough attention. Somewhere out there was the shape of the life she had been building before a cold November rain had walked her into a ballroom, and nothing had been ordinary since. She was not sure, standing here, what shape the next version was going to have. She was not sure what starting over looked like with a man who was not capable of being ordinary and a set of feelings she had not agreed to have, and a history between them that was equal parts wreckage and something she didn't have a name for yet. She was sure of one thing. Coffee, she said. He turned to look at her. Tomorrow, she said. You can take me for coffee. Somewhere that doesn't have a dress code or a security detail or a reason to be there. She paused. And you don't burn anything. Roman Calder, who had just survived a succession vote and a drawn weapon and the longest 40 minutes of the last several months, looked at her with an expression that started somewhere near relief and moved slowly toward something that was almost a smile. Not the controlled, barely there expression she had catalogued over months of watching him manage rooms and people and the distance between what he felt and what he showed. This was something that reached his eyes before he could decide whether to let it, and he didn't stop it, and she saw it happen in real time. And she turned back to the window before either of them had to do anything with it. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. They stood in the quiet of the 23rd floor, while Dominic managed the aftermath in the adjacent rooms, and Chicago continued below them, vast and indifferent and lit against the dark, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said yet, and they had both learned, at significant cost, the difference between the things that needed saying immediately and the things that needed time to become true first. That was Thursday. The coffee was Friday, at a place she chose, a small shop on the north edge of Pilsen that had mismatched chairs, and a counter that needed refinishing, and coffee that was genuinely excellent, the kind of place that had survived 15 years, because the product was good, rather than because anyone had spent money making it look like anything. She was there before him. She ordered her own coffee and sat at a table by the window and watched the street. He arrived 4 minutes after the time she had given him, which she noted as significant for a man who she suspected was accustomed to other people working around his schedule. He came in without a security presence that she could identify. though she suspected Dominic had people somewhere on the block doing something low profile, and she had decided she was not going to make an issue of that specific compromise, because she was practical and he was who he was, and some things changed slowly. He looked at the coffee shop with the expression of a man processing an environment that was entirely outside his normal parameters. He looked at the mismatched chairs. He looked at the counter. He went and ordered coffee from the woman at the register, who did not recognize him and treated him with the cheerful, efficient indifference she extended to all customers. And he came back to the table and sat across from Imani and wrapped his hands around the mug. "This is good," he said, after his first sip. "I know. How did you find it?" "I've lived on this side of the city for 6 years, Roman. I found it by walking past it." She looked at him over her own mug. "You should try that sometime. Walking past things." "I walk." "You move between secured locations." He considered this. "That's the same thing." "It is absolutely not the same thing." He almost smiled again. She was beginning to understand that almost smile as a full one, just compressed. The full version existed. She had now seen it twice, and the almost was what came out when he hadn't given himself permission for the whole thing yet. They sat with their coffee, and the noise of the shop around them, the espresso machine, a conversation at the counter, someone's stroller being maneuvered through the door, and she thought about the last 4 months in the particular way. You think about something that has changed the fundamental shape of your days, not with nostalgia, not yet, but with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "What you said at Kezia's apartment, about the hospital, about not being able to leave." She set her mug down. "I heard it. I'm not ready to tell you what I'm going to do with it, but I heard it," he nodded. "And the file," she continued. "I've thought about it a lot. Not about forgiving it, that's not the right frame. More about what it tells me about who you were then, and whether that person is still making decisions." She paused. "I think the answer is no, but I'm watching, not concluding." "That's fair," he said. "I know it's fair. I'm telling you because you should know where I am, not to negotiate." He looked at the table, then at her. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." "The morning after the diner," he said. "After you refused the money and walked away. I went back to my office, and I had Dominic pull the complete file, and I read through it again." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "And I sat there looking at $43 and eviction notices and a schedule of 3 jobs run simultaneously. And I thought, this woman is carrying all of this. And she handed back an envelope of money in the rain because she has a specific definition of what she owes the world and what the world owes her. And the definition is not small." Imani said nothing. "I didn't stop the investigation because I should have," he said. "I used it anyway, but I want you to know that it was also when I stopped seeing you as a viable candidate and started seeing you as a person whose answer I genuinely did not know." He looked at her. "That's not an excuse, it's the full truth." She held his gaze. The coffee shop continued its business around them. Someone at the next table was having an animated conversation about a parking ticket. "I know," she said finally. They drank their coffee. She paid for her own. He didn't argue. They stood outside the shop in the cold December now, proper Chicago December, the kind that arrived with intentions, and she pulled her coat tighter and said, "I have a clinic shift tomorrow, Saturday." "I know," she raised an eyebrow. "Elena mentioned your schedule," he said. I'm not monitoring it." She mentioned it. She studied him. "I'll call you Sunday," she said. "All right." She walked to the bus stop. She did not look back, but she was smiling by the time she reached it, which she allowed herself privately and without explanation. The months that followed were not a romance. That word implied a kind of smooth inevitability that was not what happened. What happened was slower and more difficult and more real than that. She did not move back into the estate. She found a better apartment, not with Roman's money, with hers, because she had been paid 2 installments under the contract that still technically existed, and she had enough to manage a deposit and first month on a place that was hers in the most fundamental sense. 2 bedrooms, because one of them she needed for studying, and because having space was not something she was going to apologize for. She called him on Sundays, as she said she would. The calls started at 20 minutes and gradually became longer, and they talked about actual things, her nursing school practicum, the logistics of the organizational restructuring he was doing, a book she was reading, the community health program she had started designing on paper in the margins of her anatomy notes. He listened to the last one with a quality of attention she had noticed. He reserved for things he found genuinely interesting, rather than things he was professionally required to engage with. "What's the funding model?" he said once in February. "I'm working on it. Grant applications and some community partnerships. I don't want it to depend on a single source." Smart. "I know, I wasn't." He paused. "Yes, all right." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing, and mostly succeeded. "What?" "I was going to suggest something, and I was trying to decide how to say it without you telling me to stay in my lane." "Just say it." "One of my freight companies has a community reinvestment commitment that generates a tax position. I could route it toward an organization with your program parameters. Completely separate from me, the money would go through a foundation structure. You'd apply like any other organization, and if you didn't qualify on merit, you wouldn't get it." She was quiet for a moment. "You'd have to recuse yourself from any review process, obviously. And if I don't qualify, I don't get it." That's what I said." She thought about it. She thought about her mother, who had refused help until she couldn't anymore, and what that refusal had cost her. She thought about the difference between accepting something because you have no choice and accepting something you have genuinely evaluated. "Send me the foundation's documentation," she said. "I'll look at it." He sent it. She looked at it. 3 weeks later, she submitted an application that she had written herself, with Patricia Osi reviewing the legal components, and it was evaluated by a board of 7 people, only 2 of whom had any connection to Roman's professional world. And it was approved on its merits in late March, and she called Roman that Sunday and said, "The application went through." "Congratulations," he said. "I haven't thanked you." "You shouldn't. You qualified." "I know I qualified." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you anyway, for constructing a process that meant the qualification was real." The silence on his end was the kind she had learned to read. "You're welcome," he said. She graduated from nursing school on a Thursday in April. Kezia was in the front row wearing a hat that was aggressively celebratory and crying from approximately the second the processional started. Imani's aunt had driven up from Carbondale and was sitting beside Kezia, books, wearing the expression of a woman who had been told something was going to happen and is genuinely moved that it has. Roman was in the back row. She hadn't told him the date. She had told Dominic, once in passing, when Dominic asked about her schedule for a week in April that required a public appearance. Dominic had apparently considered that information relevant to share. She saw him when she was walking out after the ceremony, in the crowd of families and flowers, and people taking photographs with their phones. He was in ordinary clothes, no suit, just a dark jacket and dark pants, and he was standing away from the main cluster of people with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether his presence is welcome and has decided to make himself visible so the decision can be made by someone else. She walked over to him. He looked at her in the cap and gown with an expression she had no interest in cataloging with any precisions, because some things were better experienced than analyzed. "You came," she said. "Yes. You could have told me you were coming. I wasn't sure you'd want me to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come meet my aunt." He blinked. "She drove from Carbondale," Imani said. "And she will absolutely know who you are because Kezia cannot keep a secret, and it will be less awkward if I introduce you than if she corners you near the refreshments table, which she will do." She turned toward where her aunt was standing. "Come on." He came. Her aunt, whose name was Dolores, and who had the particular quality of a woman who had seen a great deal and was no longer impressed by most of it, looked Roman Calder up and down once and said, "So you're the one." "Yes, ma'am," he said. Dolores looked at Imani. "He's polite," sometimes Imani said. "Better than nothing." Dolores looked back at Roman. "You hurt her again. I will find out about it. I have resources." "Aunt D understood," Roman said. Dolores nodded once, as if a transaction had been completed, and turned back toward the refreshments table. Roman looked at Imani. She looked at him. "Resources," he said quietly. "She volunteers at 3 organizations and knows everyone in 4 counties," Imani said. "Don't underestimate her." "I wouldn't dream of it." It was the most relaxed she had ever heard his voice, and she noticed it and turned away before she did anything premature with the noticing. Summer arrived. The community health program launched in July with 2 mobile units and a staff of 4, which was 3 more than Imani had dared to plan for in February. She ran it with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her, not manic, not frantic, just present in the specific way of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why. The patients who came to the units were real people with real problems. High blood pressure unmanaged for years, diabetes that had progressed because of a gap between diagnosis and follow-up care, children who needed vaccinations and checkups, and someone to explain what the results meant. She worked 4 days a week at the units, and 1 day at the clinic, and she was more tired than she had been during nursing school, and more certain that she was in the right place. Roman came to the launch. She had told him, directly called him on a Sunday, and said the program was launching July 12th, and she would like him to be there. Not as a donor or a connection or a public face. Just there. He was there. He stood near the back of the small crowd of community partners and city health department representatives and a local alderman and the 4 staff members who were barely managing their excitement, and he watched her speak at the small podium they had set up on the sidewalk beside the first mobile unit, and she was good at this. Not polished good, not performance good. Genuinely good, the kind that came from actually knowing what she was talking about and actually caring whether people understood it. And he watched her with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has stopped performing indifference and has not yet decided what to do with the thing that replaced it. Afterward, when the small crowd had dispersed and her staff were managing the first actual patients, and Imani was standing to the side reviewing a clipboard, he came to stand beside her. "This is what you were building," he said, in the margins. She looked at him. "What?" "When I came to the apartment for the contract signing, you had notes in the margins of your textbook. I couldn't read them from across the table, but the format was this." He looked at the mobile unit. "You were designing this during nursing school." She hadn't known he'd noticed that. "Roughly. It's significant work." "I know." She went back to the clipboard. "Don't tell me what I've built, like I didn't know I was building it. I'm not. I'm telling you that I saw the margins 3 years ago, and I see the result now, and..." He paused. "I'm telling you I was right about you." She stopped. She looked at him. "Not about the circumstances," he said. About the rest of it, the person." He looked at her steadily. "I was right about that." She held his gaze for a long moment. The street around them continued traffic. A dog walking past with its owner. One of her patients coming out of the mobile unit, looking lighter than when they'd gone in. "Yes," she said, "you were." She went back to the clipboard, but she was smiling. He had been, for months, quietly dismantling the most destructive architecture of his organization. She knew this not because he told her directly. He offered her information without volunteering it, because they had established that boundary. And he kept it, but because the shape of his days changed in ways she could observe when they spent time together, which they did, with increasing regularity and formally designating it as anything. He cut 3 operations that had no legitimate component and could not be moved in that direction. It cost him significant revenue and the loyalty of 2 captains who left rather than adapt. He navigated that the way he navigated everything with the flat, deliberate efficiencies of someone who has decided and is not revisiting the decision. The freight and construction operations expanded in the legitimate direction. A hospitality group he'd had dormant for years was restructured and relaunched with professional management that had no connection to the criminal side. He was not building a clean version of self for her benefit. She was clear-eyed enough to know that the transformation was incomplete and probably always would be, that the world he came from left marks that didn't disappear with intention, that there were things in his past, and probably that she had no full visibility into, and had made a careful adult decision not to require full visibility into, because she was not naive, and she was not a project manager of another person's soul, and because she had her own work to do. What she observed was the direction of his choices. That was what she had told herself she would watch, and she watched it, and the direction was consistent. In October, nearly a year after a cold November rain had walked her into a ballroom and changed the coordinates of her life, Dominic called her on a Wednesday morning. She was between patients at the clinic. She stepped outside. "I want you to know something," Dominic said. He had called her directly, perhaps 4 times in the year she had known him, and each time it had been significant. Roman formally signed the succession agreement yesterday. The Calder leadership is consolidated under him, officially and permanently. She processed this, without the marriage clause. The family council amended the succession terms after the Lucian resolution. The amendment removes the marriage requirement retroactively. A pause. He's been running the organization under his full authority for 6 months. Yesterday was the formal documentation. She looked at the street. At the ordinary Wednesday morning of it, he didn't tell me. No. Dominic was quiet for a moment. He didn't want it to look like he was keeping score. She thought about that. Thank you for telling me. You'd have found out eventually. I thought sooner was better. She went back inside and finished her shift and drove herself home. She had a car now. Modest, practical, hers. And she sat in her apartment in the evening, with the lights on low, and thought about a man who had signed away the need for a marriage certificate and not mentioned it, and what that said and what she was going to do with it. She called him. I know about the succession document, she said. A pause. Dominic, yes. She looked at her hands. You didn't need the marriage for months. You've been... She stopped. The offer you made me in the fall. Coffee without conditions. Yes. Was that still the contract? Was that still you, building the appearance you needed? The line was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. The contract has been void since the council amended the terms. The coffee was... Another pause. The Sundays were what I wanted, not what I needed. She sat with that. Come over, she said. A brief silence. Now? Yes. Now. He came. She opened the door, and he was standing in her hallway without the coat, without the armor of the formality he had worn in every space she'd seen him occupy except for the kitchen late at night. And he looked like a man who had driven across the city on a Wednesday evening, because she called to and had not stopped to calculate whether it was strategically sound. She stepped back to let him in. He came in. She closed the door. They stood in her small living room with the low lighting, and the sound of the city through the window. And she looked at him, and he looked at her. And the distance between the formal contract and the present moment was very large. And also, she understood now, not as wide as she had kept insisting it was. I'm not ready to say everything, she said, about what this is. I need you to be all right with that. I am. I'm also not going to perform certainty I don't have. I know. And the program is mine, independently mine. Yes. And I still have conditions. Something in his face moved. How many? She looked at him. 1. He waited. Don't burn breakfast, she said. It was a few seconds before he laughed. It was the full version, not the compressed almost, not the controlled almost smile, just genuine, unguarded laughter in her living room on a Wednesday evening, and it changed his face entirely. And she stood there and looked at it and let herself have the full experience of it without immediately retreating. Then she crossed the room and she took his face in both her hands and she kissed him, and he held completely still. For the half second, it took him to understand that this was real. And then he put his arms around her and pulled her close and kissed her back with the entirety of someone who has been waiting a long time and is not going to do anything to interrupt this by moving too fast. They stood in her living room for a long time. When she stepped back, her hand still on his face, she looked at him at close range and thought about everything it had cost to get here. The ballroom, the rain, the diner, the contract, the hospital chair, the file on her bed, the council room, the almost smiles and the late kitchens and the Sunday holts and the graduation row and the space between what people say they are and what they actually do when it matters. I'm not going to tell you I love you tonight, she said. Okay. Not because I don't know. Because when I say it, I want to say it once and mean it completely, and not have it be something I said in a living room 2 minutes after a first kiss. He looked at her. His hands were at her waist. When you're ready. Yes. She stepped back fully. She looked at him across her small living room. Stay. I'll make dinner. I know I don't have to. I want to. She went toward the kitchen. Sit somewhere that isn't in my way. He sat at her kitchen table, the small one, with 2 chairs, completely different from the estate's dining room, and he watched her cook, and she was aware of being watched in a way that was not surveillance and not assessment, and not the careful cataloging of the vulnerability profile she represented. She was aware of it, the way you're aware of warmth from a direction you hadn't expected. She made pasta. It was not complicated. It was good, because she was good at the things she practiced, and she set the bowl in front of him and sat across. And they ate at her small table with the city outside and no contract between them and no deadline and no one in any adjacent room managing anything. He ate. She ate. At some point, this is better than anything Elena has made in 11 years. Don't tell Elena that I wouldn't. Good. She cleared the plates. He stood to help without being asked, and she accepted without commenting on it. They washed up side by side at her small sink, which required a logistical negotiation of space that they managed without awkwardness, which told her something she filed quietly. Afterward, he put on his jacket to leave, and at the door he stopped and turned, and he said, "Imani." She looked at him. He said, "I know I'm not what you planned for." "No," she said, "you're not. And I know that what I'm offering is complicated. Permanently. That the complications don't resolve. I know that too. I'm telling you because I want to be honest with you. Not because I'm trying to talk you out of something." He met her eyes. "I'm not capable of talking you out of anything. I've known that since the diner." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go home, Roman." He nodded. He opened the door. "Sunday," she said. He turned. "Call me Sunday," she said, like always. Something moved through his face that she recognized as the full version of every almost she had watched him contain for a year. "Sunday," he said. He left. She closed the door. She stood with her back indented in the quiet of her own apartment, in the life she had built from the rubble of the worst professional night of her life, with a nursing license on the wall she hadn't hung yet, and a community health program with 2 mobile units and a grant renewal due in February, and a small brass bracelet on her wrist from Kezia, and the specific earned certainty of someone who has carried a heavy thing a long way and knows exactly how strong that makes her. She pushed off the door. She went to the window. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always did, glittering and cold and vast, indifferent to the small interior revolutions of the people moving through it. Somewhere in the city, a man was driving home in his own car, and he would call on Sunday, and she would answer, and they would build whatever came next from the beginning, without a contract, without a deadline, without the careful infrastructure of need and desperation and circumstance that had first put them in the same room. Just 2 people, complicated, imperfect, still becoming people. She looked at the ring, the simple one from the civil ceremony that she had put back on her right hand at some point in the last several months, and not examined too carefully. She moved it to her left hand. She looked at it there for a moment. Then she turned from the window and went to her desk and opened her laptop to the grant renewal document and got back to work, because the program needed her in the morning, and the city needed the program, and she needed to be useful in the most concrete and verifiable sense. And that need, the oldest, most fundamental thing about her, had survived everything intact. The rain started sometime after midnight. She heard it against the window while she was working, that particular sound of Chicago November doing what it always did. And she thought briefly, without sentimentality, about another rain a year ago, and a ballroom and a finger pointing, and a man who had risen from his chair and changed the direction of an evening. She thought about who she had been walking through that rain alone. She thought about who she was now, not a different person. The same person, more fully inhabited. The same stubbornness, the same practicality, the same refusal to occupy less space than she deserved. The same woman who handed back money in the rain and meant it. The same woman who had looked into the eyes of the most feared man in Chicago and had not looked away, because she had never been someone who looked away from things that were real, just more of herself. Room finally made for it. She saved the document. She closed the laptop. She went to bed. Outside, the rain continued, steady and indifferent and cold, falling on a city that held, within its ordinary November dark, a ballroom where no one was humiliated anymore, 2 mobile health units parked in their overnight positions, a community of people who would come tomorrow for care they had not previously had access to, and a man sitting in his kitchen at a table that had never felt its proper size until someone else had sat or sit. She slept, without difficulty, without rehearsing anything, without carrying what she had already set down. The city held all of it, and the rain kept falling, and the story did what every true story eventually does. Whether it ends neatly or not, it kept going, not because anything was resolved into simplicity, but because the people inside it had chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to continue, to remain, To show up again on Sunday and the Sunday after that. That was the whole of it. That was everything.